So we are ready to go here on the PN Pod. It is Friday, August 7th today, and I'm joined by special guest Dan Shafer, author. Are you author, publisher? I don't know exactly what your title is with the Recombobulation Area. Maybe specify that for us at the start.
Yeah, all of it applies. I go by
Yeah.
founding editor. It's an independent publication that I founded in 2019, and have just returned back to being an independent publication over the last month here. And it has been some discombobulating times in
Yeah.
Wisconsin politics over the last month to be going back to being independent, but certainly no shortage of things to write about and talk about and all of that here.
Yeah,
So.
definitely highly recommended for Wisconsin political coverage. And I've noticed that you find ways to work in discombobulated and recombobulated into your writing, which I always get a kick out of. And for those who don't know, and I guess I'm not 100% sure in this, but the recombobulation area, I believe, is like an area in the Milwaukee airport, right? Like after you land, explain that briefly for us.
So yeah, it is a very Milwaukee specific thing. It is something that I have always really loved. It's a goofy made up word. So like when you go through security, getting to your flight, go through all of the different things and the scans and whatever else. And at the end of it, there is a sign up that says the Recombobulation Area. And it is the only airport in the world that has a sign that says the Recombobulation Area. The former director there put it up on his own. He had a kind of a sense of humor about it. But, we have this discombobulating politics in the state of Wisconsin. So just as you go through security, it's a discombobulating experience. You got to put your bags and shoes and all of the things together before you make it to your gate. I try to offer a similar type of experience in
Sure.
Wisconsin politics and just making sense of the absolutely wild political landscape that we have in our state.
Yes. And we will get into that. I've actually never set foot in the Milwaukee airport because being here in the Twin Cities, that's one of the few metros that we can comfortably drive to. It's about a 3.5, 4 hour drive. So no need to fly, although I suppose that would make it even quicker. And, maybe one of these decades we'll have high-speed rail that'll make it even quicker. I know there is rail that can go from here to both Chicago and Milwaukee, but there's a lot of stops along the way. And if you have like a specific thing you need to be in town for, the time, it can be kind of tough. So, maybe one of these years I'll see the airport there. But in the meantime, I guess when I heard recombobulation area, I had like an idea of like a smoking lounge or something like that. And, Wisconsin, you guys have a little bit more liberal laws with drinking, at least. I'm not sure with smoking. Can you still smoke inside there at all, or is that
Definitely not. No,
okay.
That's a thing of the past. Yeah.
We all learned about your a little bit about your liquor laws with the Tony Romo incident.
That was interesting to see the whole country realize that it's just really a slap on the wrist for that kind of thing in our state. The Tavern League of Wisconsin is a very strong political lobby, that's for sure.
Yes, and that was one of those stories that on X at least turned into a bit of a controversy where I saw people weighing in saying that the Tony Romo thing is an example of why you should never consent to a sobriety test roadside, because people were arguing that it didn't seem like he was intoxicated, even though to me it did seem like he was. And then it turned out that I think he had like an open container in the vehicle as well, as we learned later. So a very Wisconsin story. And, it's one of those ones that I got some laughs out of and some jollies, even though, it really isn't funny to be driving intoxicated. Obviously, really bad things can happen, but
always a Wisconsin connection with any story like that.
Any Wisconsin,
and even in the CBS booth, I saw Romo they were taking him out for a little while, and they have to fill their Wisconsin quota by having J.J. Watt replace him there. Who I actually went to the same high school as J.J. Watt. So
wow.
Yeah.
Another proud son of Wisconsin who also went to University of Wisconsin, right?
That's right.
Yep, a proud college program there. But you didn't come here to hear us talk about football or drinking Wisconsin. You came here to hear us talk about Wisconsin politics, and we're obviously coming to you just a few days before the primaries in Wisconsin next Tuesday. And somewhat surprisingly, I would say, the Wisconsin gubernatorial race has become kind of one of the more prominent ones in the country, which, given that it's a state office and not a federal one, is a little bit surprising, but it's become sort of like a proxy war for some of the cross currents or battles that we see in national politics with the rise of the DSA and kind of the struggle of more establishment candidates to, fend that off. And in the gubernatorial race, which I guess we'll start there, we've had the rise of Francesca Hong, who is a state legislator from Madison, who seems poised to win the primary next week. I saw there's polling out just today that has her up by like a 2-1 margin on the next candidates behind her. And Hong, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Dan, but is a DSA member, but just to the local chapter, not the national chapter, which or the national organization. Which when she was on CNN, this came up, and she kind of used that to fend off accusations that she supports all the different policy planks that the national DSA supports, some of which are pretty far left for a state like Wisconsin. Which certainly is purple at this point. But I think her CNN appearance at least will probably be best remembered for the question that she was asked in reference to tweets that she posted, I think, in 2020, where she basically endorsed the cancellation of Thanksgiving, whatever that would entail. And when she was asked on CNN if she still supports canceling Thanksgiving, her answer was not no. She did kind of note that as a chef, she's cooked Thanksgiving meals for people and sort of implied that she's made her peace with it. And then as a response in CNN, it generated some blowback. I saw that she clarified, or at least her campaign did, and came out and said that she does not support canceling Thanksgiving, which, it's kind of a silly topic. And I saw a lot of people, especially on Blue Sky, kind of taking umbrage that was even a question in a TV interview. But, I think it's important to kind of know where the candidates are at ideologically. And Dan, I know you had a piece this week citing that CNN appearance and others that Hong has done as raising concerns among Democrats as to whether she is ready to take on the presumptive Republican candidate, who is a congressman named Tom Tiffany, who represents kind of a rural part of Wisconsin in the western part of the state. So you tell me about your reporting there on that piece, who you were hearing from, and just kind of what the vibes are like surrounding Hong at this point.
Yeah, I mean, so we just saw some new polling really over the past couple hours here from State Navigate, polling the Democratic field after Mandela Barnes left the race a little over a week ago. It's the first poll since he left the race, and it shows Hong with a commanding lead in this primary, and she was at 44%. The next closest challenger was Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley at 22%. She is the overwhelming favorite to be winning this primary next week. I think with, the media attention that so many Democratic socialists have been getting over the past bit, with the sort of winning streak that a number of these candidates have been seeing as of late. And I think with Wisconsin being just a bellwether state in so many instances, so many people are going to look to Wisconsin to see how the trends are moving, to see how things are changing in it as this kind of like indicative of what might happen nationwide. And I think Hong's rise in this primary can be attributed to a number of things. And you're right, the national attention that she has received, she's been on a whole bunch of different national media outlets over the past week here. That wasn't necessarily received all that well by a bunch of Wisconsin Democrats who are noting that, she needs to be who had some quotes that I had in that piece. And people are a little bit worried after that CNN interview, because it's just the type of thing that, it's not a policy thing. It doesn't actually matter, but it's the type of thing that breaks through to non-political, not tuned in audiences. And I think that really gave people some pause and just forced a number of folks to just take a beat and say, what's this campaign really focused on? One of the quotes that I had from a Democratic source who was commenting on the Hong campaign there said, the central tension of this campaign is between the folks who want Francesca Hong to be governor of Wisconsin and the folks who want her campaign to be for socialism. And so I think I asked the campaign about this, and they offered up some answers as well, reiterating that the focus is on Wisconsin. They just started a multi-city get out the vote tour that the campaign is going to be going on across the state all weekend and through the election day on Tuesday. I think too, it's that ground, the get out the vote tour is just reemphasizing one of the things that has really separated her in this primary is because she has had a terrific ground game. They has really shown up in community after community. They've really emphasized that. They've had a very unconventional campaign where it has been, it hasn't had like the traditional TV advertising, and it hasn't taken the traditional approach, but they've just out-hustled and outworked everybody in this campaign. And, Francesca Hong comes from a service industry background. Before she ran for state assembly in 2020, she was a chef and owner of a restaurant in Madison. And I think she's really brought a lot of that service industry hustle to this race. And when she first entered it, I didn't consider her as to necessarily be among the top tier of candidates, but I characterized her as the wild card in this race because I thought she would bring an element to it that many of the other more traditional candidates would not be bringing. And I thought that, just her relentless work ethic through all of this is going to force every other candidate to up their game. And that kind of really issued a challenge to other folks. And a lot of the other more traditional candidates did not meet that challenge.
Yeah.
And she has really, consolidated a ton of support, particularly among young voters in Wisconsin. Some of this polling that we saw from State Navigate today showed that just her with absolutely dominant numbers with voters under 45. She's at 79% in the Democratic field here with voters 18 to 29. She's at 68% with voters 30 to 44. So she's just so far ahead of the field with younger voters. And I think one of the issues that has really resonated in this campaign, and she took an early stand on, has been about data centers. And she became the candidate who was for a data center moratorium in Wisconsin. And we've been seeing news story after news story of these big tech corporations wanting to build these mega, hyperscale AI data centers. And people are really skeptical of that in Wisconsin, not just for all of the other reasons that a lot of Great Lakes states have seen a lot of skepticism about data centers, but also because of the Foxconn project that flamed out so spectacularly in Wisconsin that was, this major promise in Racine County. It was going to bring tens of thousands of jobs. It was going to be, Trump called it the eighth wonder of the world. It was Scott Walker's signature economic achievement. And it just has been an absolute bumbling disaster for the past several, since, 2017 when shovels hit the dirt there. And so I think that is yet another reason why that issue in particular has resonated. And there was a moment in the campaign too where, all of the 7 candidates were asked, do you support a data center moratorium? And she was the only one who flipped her placard to green and said yes. And I think that really separated her from the rest of the field, where if you had multiple candidates who were backing this data center moratorium, it would have given those anti-data center voters options. Instead, they all went to Francesca Hong. And that she's really been able to ride that momentum with that, throughout the primary. And now she is poised to win it next week, I think.
Yeah. And we don't need to get too deep in the weeds here, but I am curious about some of the circumstances that led to her being the front runner. And I'm glad, Dan, that you kind of tick through some of the reasons why she is a strong candidate, because, I think it's important to, also kind of emphasize the positive appeal that someone like her has, although on the more establishment wing of things, there was kind of a spectacular implosion that led to her kind of being like the last candidate standing almost in a way, where you had, and maybe, so you have the outgoing governor Evers, who is quite popular, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it seems like he's been like a steady hand, unspectacular. He's not a guy who kind of oozes charisma or does a lot of media, but he won 2 terms there, right? And
he said in his victory speech in 2022 when he won re-election, his quote was "boring wins."
Yeah.
So yes,
yeah, and that's a very that would if you had to kind of come up with a slogan for him, it might be that. But we had this fiasco where he endorsed the candidate who ended up having like real. I believe her name is Rodriguez, right? Is that correct? Or
So his current lieutenant governor is Sarah Rodriguez. So Evers was going to, he was not endorsing early in the primary, and Sarah Rodriguez and Mandela Barnes and Francesca Hong had kind of formed a top 3 of sorts earlier this spring. Hong's campaign really began to take off with younger voters and the data center issue and all of that. Mandela Barnes came into this race with by far the highest name ID from anybody else, coming off of his 2022 run against your favorite Senator, Ron Johnson. And Sarah Rodriguez as the lieutenant governor, she was beginning to kind of consolidate some of the more institutional support in the state. So she was starting to pick up some union endorsements. She won the straw poll at the state party convention in June. And I had heard that she was starting to pick up some endorsements from like some of the purple district legislators around Wisconsin. But then everything changed on July 12th when the Rodriguez campaign issued a press release saying that they were firing their campaign manager over major potential violations of their campaign finance. That became an absolute circus that week of just figuring out, did this campaign actually raise any money? Is there something more going on here? And so she issued that press release on a Sunday night that was after a strong week of news where, Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley had dropped out of the race to endorse Rodriguez. And it seemed like it was going towards a race that I thought was going to be Rodriguez versus Hong in the home stretch here. And the Rodriguez campaign implosion just absolutely changed everything. And so she left the race on Friday. People were calling David Crowley and saying, "Hey, you got out of the race on, bad information. You were misled by the Rodriguez campaign. You should get back in." So then he gets back into the race less than a week later and does so with the endorsement of Governor Tony Evers. So Evers was on the sidelines for the endorsements the whole time. When Crowley got back in, he decides to get behind Crowley. The interesting timing of this was that Evers was actually on a trade mission to Africa as this was all unfolding. So he wasn't actually there to visibly be at the David Crowley campaign relaunch event in Milwaukee that happened. And so Crowley has been able to consolidate some support over the past several weeks. A number of unions have backed him, professional firefighters, building trades, and whatnot. And, Mandela Barnes drops out of the race a week ago. But the polling still shows Crowley pretty well behind Hong. And there are still two other candidates in the field as well. State Senator Kelda Roys of Madison and Joel Brennan, who was a former cabinet official from Tony Evers' first term. Those two are still in the race. They had been polling in the single digits. Kelda Roys finally polled with 11% today in that state Navigate poll, but again, still well behind where Hong is at 44%.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what seems like it's going to be the matchup in November, which is Hong versus Tom Tiffany. Now, I pretty much know Tiffany from his regular appearances on Newsmax and Fox, and he actually is a guy who goes on even the further right, more fringe shows, kind of like Steve Bannon or like the Charlie Kirk Show, which they still call it that, even though Charlie is no longer with us. But he does a lot of right-wing media, and he has indulged some of Trump's election lies. I know he signed onto the challenge that Mike Johnson organized back in late 2020, 2021, where they tried to get the Supreme Court to intervene, which they did not do. He's anti-vax. Even as early as 2021, he was kind of raising concerns about people being injured by the vaccine, and so in a lot of ways, he kind of seems to me like almost like a mini Ron Johnson, where I think you'd have a hard time kind of finding a lot of daylight politically between the two. And maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, because obviously Johnson has won a number of times statewide in Wisconsin. But what's your assessment of Tiffany as a politician, and to the extent there's been any polling information that we can glean about how the Hong Tiffany matchup is shaping up? How do you handicap that?
Yeah, it's, so many people have remarked over the years about how different our two U.S. senators are, with Tammy Baldwin and Ron Johnson being about as far apart politically as you can get from two U.S. senators. I think Francesca Hong and Tom Tiffany are even further apart. I think you can make the argument that Tom Tiffany is to the right of Ron Johnson on a number of issues. You mentioned the effort to overturn the election. He was one of the members of the House who voted to overturn the election after the events of January 6th, voted to, nullify those votes and all that, and even said in interviews the days later, Wisconsin wasn't part of that final vote. He said he would have overturned Wisconsin votes there too. So he is very far to the right. And in his campaign, there were a few Republicans who jumped into the race early, but once Trump endorsed Tiffany, that was essentially the end of the primary. And I think Trump's poll numbers have absolutely been tanking in Wisconsin. As we've had this chaotic primary, nobody's really talking about that. But Trump's poll numbers are terrible in Wisconsin. People in the state really do not like tariffs in particular. The Iran war, people are very much against that in the state of Wisconsin too. And Tiffany has really put absolutely no daylight between himself and the president on really any issue. It remains to be, he's had all of this runway to run as a general election candidate facing really nobody else in the primary. And he has essentially run to the right of, no one else in the primary. I expect this will be, he will try to replicate the Trump's path to victory that he had in the 2024 election by, reaching some of those lower propensity voters that were kind of like Trump only voters. Always remains to be seen what type of turnout there's going to be among those voters when Trump is not on the ballot in the midterm election. Um, and like you said, he's got all of this far right record. He's trying to trample the Constitution and get rid of birthright citizenship. Like he's really far out there. He's the one of the only members of the House to vote against making Juneteenth Day a holiday a number of years ago. So, I think it also represents a pretty big shift in kind of the center of power for Republican politics in Wisconsin. For so long, it was the WOW counties, crucial Waukesha County, right? Well, Tiffany's not from the WOW counties. I don't know if he's going to be able to move turnout there. He's from the Northwoods. His district in the 7th congressional district is the northernmost district in the state of Wisconsin. That I think that really shows how the Republican Party in Wisconsin used to be this Scott Walker suburban party, and now it is very much a more kind of like Northwoods rural party. And he's really leaned into that kind of like kind of like visual messaging of kind of the Wisconsin Supper Club or up north type of vibes of it too.
Yeah, I think his district actually is the one that is adjacent to the Minnesota border over on this
Mhm.
part of the state. So, we spent some time in years prior, before we moved into Minneapolis, living up near Forest Lake, and you could cross the border there into what's a cute little town right across the border there? I'm blanking on the name, but it's near Hudson, a little bit north of Hudson there, Osceola, Wisconsin.
There you go.
And I believe that's in his district, which, I mean, you see Trump signs everywhere there, but that's actually, I hadn't quite thought of it that way, that, the power center for the Republican Party in Wisconsin, notoriously, for a very long time, was the eastern part of the state, and which is, pretty heavily populated in those suburban
Mhm.
areas. And I believe his district is probably the most expansive because it is the least population dense in the state. So
That's right.
that is, I think that reflects kind of broader shifts. You mentioned Trump's numbers tanking in Wisconsin, and tariffs being a big reason why. Is that, do you describe kind of the economic conditions to being most of it, or what's going on there? Because even here in Minnesota, they're down, kind of reflecting what the national trend has been, but the bottom hasn't really fallen out. So I'm not sure if that's kind of also the case in Wisconsin, or if there's something unique going on there. What's your read on that?
Yeah, so the Marquette University Law School poll, it surveys, it's kind of the gold standard public opinion poll in Wisconsin beyond just kind of the horse race stuff. They include all of these, just different down ballot issue type questions as well. And you see over and over again that Wisconsinites really do not like tariffs. They really do not like the Iran war. There are a lot of Trump policies that people in the state really do not agree with. And of both of his terms as president, you know, this most recent poll of Trump's approval was the lowest it has ever been.
Hmm.
And so I think, the fact that it's basically like, kind of even here and it is straight line down over the last several polls. And I think that is going to be a huge struggle for Tom Tiffany and for Republicans up and down the ballot as the economy continues to wobble. I mean, we had some really tough numbers on the economy today. And I think Wisconsin is this very heavily manufacturing and agriculture state where, the pitch from the rhetoric from Trump and Vance in the 2024 campaign is, we're going to bring manufacturing back. We're gonna bring, farming back. And just the economic realities of what has happened with these tariffs, it hasn't worked. It's obviously not working. People can see it in their own lives. And so I think the number one reason is that people are always going to vote for is going to be on some of those economic issues. And those economic issues are real trouble for the president. And I think in past years, in his first term, people would give him higher marks on the economy. And, now that cost of living is the number one issue, and he has not really done anything to address that, I think that's going to be a real problem for him too.
Yeah, there's a question earlier from Wendy in the chat for Dan, and she says, I'm voting for Hong, but I have friends that are afraid that non-MAGA Republicans that may vote for a Democrat won't vote for her because they see her as too far left. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly the calculus for this election. I think that is, the democratic socialism of it all. I think is going to have force people who might be, I guess, more politically in the center to have some difficult questions. But I think for me, it's the fact that Tom Tiffany voted to overturn the election is a disqualifying element for me. And if you can disagree with someone on policy, like you can't disagree with somebody on the fundamentals of what a democratic system is. The only way we can have disagreements on policy and disagree on like what democratic socialism is because we have those democratic fundamentals. And so I think, Tom Tiffany, the fact that he voted to overturn the election, um, that to me is a much bigger problem than any random comments about Thanksgiving.
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, you could say, Ron Johnson obviously supported those efforts as well and was involved in the fake elector stuff and then won in 2022. So apparently, there's at least a critical mass of voters who weren't bothered enough, at least at that point, to not vote for him, right?
That's true. And Ron Johnson, I think, has, Wisconsin Democrats have been on kind of this winning streak over the last, post Trump era. Um, and where I think it's like 18 of the last 21 statewide elections have been won by a Democrat or a democratically aligned candidate. And I think one of those wins have been from Republicans was from Ron Johnson in 2022. But it was also the closest U.S. Senate race that we had seen in 100 years. And so that was extremely narrow victory for Ron Johnson. It came down to like 27,000 votes. But I think he has been able to kind of bridge kind of two eras of Republican politics in a certain way. He came in 2010 as part of the Tea Party, Scott Walker, Paul Ryan, it's so much Wisconsin attention that was happening in the early 2010s there. And he was very much a part of that. But I think he has been able to kind of find a way to bridge that like Tea Party business guy mentality that he came in with in 2010 to just like the conspiracy MAGA far right fringe
Yeah.
guy
Well,
that he is now.
let me jump in there because I just want to tick through some of the things that Johnson has said the past couple weeks. So I'm just going to read a few quotes here. July 22nd, he said, "We have never fully investigated what happened in 2020." So he's back on the election lies. A few days later, he claimed during a hearing, this was during the Fauci hearing where Fauci was taking the fifth, but the Republicans were still kind of doing, speeches. He said that the vaccine injured have rising suicide rates. That same day, these injections caused death. And then this week, he had a riff about how Aaron Rodgers was smart enough to take ivermectin when he got COVID. Unfortunately, more people didn't follow him. We wouldn't have had as many of these athletes falling unconscious, sometimes dead on the field of play. You've seen the video reels of this happening in 2021. That's a quote. And then even more recently, this was just yesterday, he said, quote, "I'm not downplaying a bad flu season, but," and he went on to, kind of make a case that some of the methods to, stop the spread of COVID were unnecessary and actually kind of counterproductive. And then, of course, he threw in some racism yesterday, too, referring to Al Sayed as, quote, "the candidate, however you pronounce his name, in Michigan," end quote. So we've really had kind of the smorgasbord of the conspiracies and kind of the, the bigotry, straight up lies about athletes dropping dead on the field, which is not something that happened ever, or at least at any time where that had any conjunction with the COVID vaccines. So yeah, you mentioned. I mean, is it just really as simple as he kind of, as you talked about, sort of bridge that gap between sort of the business Republicans and the more conspiratorial wing? Because at least in a state like Minnesota, I mean, maybe this is a little bit of a difference between Minnesota and Wisconsin, even though we're kind of sister states in a lot of ways. Is that the conspiracy stuff doesn't play super well here? I mean, we're probably going to have Mike Lindell as the gubernatorial candidate, but I don't think the polls are going to give him any sort of shot at any point against Amy Klobuchar, and that'll be a lopsided result. Whereas Ron Johnson is kind of a powerhouse in Wisconsin politics. So sometimes with politicians like that, you can kind of someone like me when you're kind of covering it nationally, you can miss parts of their appeal, and maybe he's just a really good constituent service guy where people reach out to his office and they help him. You're shaking your head no, but
No,
is there something that we're missing? I guess is a question that explains his skill.
He's not great with the constituent service. He has a bad reputation with constituent services
Okay.
too. It's like you even hear from Republicans who will go to Tammy Baldwin because they know she can actually get something done when it comes to constituent services and all that. But I think one of the things that too is that Johnson has been on the ballot 3 times, and it is 3 of the most advantageous election cycles for Republicans over the past 20 years, in 2010 and 2016 and 2022. And the fact that he won by just such a narrow number in 2022 against Mandela Barnes, showed he was vulnerable, and that the what ifs will be endless from that election, and still are 4 years later. But I think he has been able to, again, I just think he's been able to bridge these kind of eras of Republican politics in a significant way. And he has long been backed by some of the biggest Republican donors in the country, the Uline family, which owns the Uline packaging company, which is based in southeastern Wisconsin, just north of the Illinois border. And they have been the main bankrollers of Ron Johnson for so many years. And so, like, that was a big part of why he was able to win in 2022 as well, because the outside spending was just like enormously in favor of Ron Johnson in that race. And then I think, you have this interesting dynamic that will unfold with Johnson too, where he doesn't really do that much, and just like he'll make headlines and your clips and all of that for his insane views on things, but like he's not a doer.
Hmm.
Tammy Baldwin is the senator, and I will always joke that she's Wisconsin's only senator, because she's the only one who's actually getting anything done, and it's Johnson who's just doing this vaccine circus or
Yes.
whatever else, and it's just like it's just the noise versus the reality of actually getting stuff done.
Yeah. I mean, there was a clip I posted. This was just like maybe a week or two ago, maybe closer to two, where I was ahead of the Fauci hearing. So he went on Maria Bartiromo's show. It was right after that horrible tornado in Wisconsin. So, it felt like he couldn't avoid mentioning it. But, he was literally kind of like at the top of the interview, like, and I just want to extend thoughts and prayers to my constituents. I know you're having a hard time. But now onto the Fauci thing, and like he just pivoted, and then it was 15 minutes on vaccines and Fauci. Now, I will say, to his very small amount of credit, he did do a Newsmax appearance more recently where he was on the ground there with Greta Van Susteren, going through some of the communities that had been affected, and so I mean, at least optically, it looked like he was trying, but you're right that he's never going on cable to talk about kind of Midwest or Wisconsin issues. It's always conspiracies, Trump's fantasies and things like that. So, was there a dynamic in 2022 because he's not a super, Mandela Barnes at that time was regarded as kind of like a rising star. As you alluded to, it was a very close race. It came down to just a few thousand votes. And then, he gave another shot this year with the gubernatorial election, never really had traction. There was kind of this controversial reporting about allegations that, he was engaged in like inappropriate relationships with women, where I know that there's some question as to whether that kind of rose to the level of the reporting that was done in some of the local publications, because there wasn't any allegation of like assault or anything that rise to the level of criminality, but it was kind of allegations that when alcohol was involved, he would have inappropriate relations with younger women, going back many years now. I think like 2018, the allegations were. But is the fact that Barnes wasn't able to get any traction this year just kind of like a hangover from 2022, and you lose a race that had really high stakes, and maybe it's hard for people to kind of put their faith in you again after that?
Yeah, I mean, I would, check out the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel's reporting. I'm not going to comment further on that, the specifics of that, because I don't know details beyond what's in the report there.
Yeah.
But I think there was some trepidation with Barnes getting back into the race, and I think it has to do with the loss to Ron Johnson. Like that's just people will see Ron Johnson in the news and on your clips and all of that, and just be like, think back to that loss there. And I wrote a piece last fall before Barnes got into the race, saying that like his run was both overrated and underrated at the same time.
Hmm.
And I think underrated in the sense that he was going up against a 2-term incumbent who was well funded, who despite all of the things is very very popular among Wisconsin Republicans, and so I think Barnes both overcame a lot in that election, but I think he missed some opportunities as well. There's some of the ads. There was this ad with him making a peanut butter sandwich over and over. They just kind of ran over and over, and I just didn't think that was particularly successful. And then I felt like they kind of ran against Ron Johnson as if he were generic Republican and not uniquely problematic senator who is Ron Johnson. And so I think there were some missed opportunities on the campaign as well. And kind of my end point with that was that if Ron, and I think there were parts of the Barnes campaign that were a little bit too safe. And my end point there was that if he ran a campaign like he did in 2022, that he would not be successful in this gubernatorial run. And despite coming in with the highest name ID by far, there was like some of this early polling from Marquette that showed him with 70% name ID, but only 10% in the polls or whatever it is. And I think there were a lot of skepticism. People wanted to see something different from him on the campaign trail. And I don't think whatever difference that they may have had in the campaign, it didn't really break through. It didn't really resonate with voters, and he ultimately drops out of the race before election day, despite even as he was polling kind of roughly second place in the polls.
Yeah, let's close it out with a little bit of the down-ballot stuff that's coming up next Tuesday as well. I know you've done some reporting. You kind of flagged as we were texting before we went live here that Derrick Van Orden, who is a congressman from the southwestern part of the state, I think the district that's actually just below Tom Tiffany's,
Mhm.
who has really kind of established himself as like the Trump bootlicker. I mean, I guess it's hard to say that. There's like a group of them. You probably can't single him out, but he's so thirsty for Trump's attention. There was a video of him trying to shake Trump's hand at one point. Trump kind of brushed him off or didn't see him, and then he looked kind of heartbroken that Trump would acknowledge him. But then recently he flew to an event in Wisconsin on Air Force One, and he was posting on Twitter about this. He just seemed happy as a clam to be on the plane with Trump. And so that seems to be kind of his whole identity. I mean, he also seems a little bit unglued, where there have been allegations of drinking, and even in his interactions with reporters can be kind of menacing. And he has a military background. But that part of the state, is becoming, I think, a little more purple. And so explain what's going on there and how in danger his seat is this cycle.
Yeah, I think, of the 8 congressional districts in Wisconsin, that race is going to be the most competitive one. It was held by a Democrat, Ron Kind, for quite some time, but flipped to Derrick Van Orden in 2022. But, he in the polls, he consistently is not been demonstrated as a particularly strong candidate. He has run behind the top of the ticket in these election cycles. In the last election in 2024, the candidate was Rebecca Cooke, who is running again and is probably the favorite to win in that primary. She Cooke ran a pretty strong race there, outran the top of the ticket. Did better than Tammy Baldwin in Western Wisconsin, which I found to be pretty impressive as a run. And she turned right back around and started running again in this race. One of the issues in that there is a primary there too, so she does have to clear that hurdle next week as well. One of the issues in that primary that's been raised by her competitor there, Eau Claire Council President Emily Berge, she's taken issue with some of the early endorsements that national groups have made. So I think some people, this is yet another one of these like what the establishment should or should not be doing types of conversations that has permeated that race as well. But I think Cooke can be a really strong candidate if she emerges from that primary, and I think that race is listed as a toss-up. I've even seen some lean D characterizations in that race as well. So that's certainly going to be one to watch. I think that's the toss-up race in the congressional races in Wisconsin for sure.
Okay. Is Eau Claire in Van Orden's district?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Wow. So that must be kind of the part of that district that sort of pulls it a little more blue, or I mean, it's at least a kind of a college town.
Yeah, and I think the Western Wisconsin has a real independent streak. It's kind of Eau Claire and La Crosse and Stevens Point are all college towns that are part of the 3rd congressional district, and this is kind of like the Obama-Trump headquarters for the country in a lot of ways. Like that driftless region that includes parts of Minnesota and Iowa and Wisconsin has been really like there was a strong support for Obama and then swung really hard to Trump. So I think there's a lot of like anti-establishment type of energy there as well. And so, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there because, Van Orden, I mean, when he did win in 2022, there was no national support for the Democratic candidate there, Brad Pfaff. And they were just like, oh, we think Van Orden's going to win there. This is a district Trump won, by 7 points or whatever it was. And they did not invest there at all. And Pfaff became within 3.5 points of beating Van Orden. Van Orden, not a strong electoral performer, has been crazy, has been, in the headlines for all sorts of things. He was like berating library employees for having an LGBTQ, stand in the library at some point. I believe that happened in and around La Crosse a number of years ago. And so he's pretty unhinged. He's very much out there. And I think, because of that, and because, Cooke, I think, is a pretty strong candidate. Like she is, from an endorsement perspective, like she has the endorsement of Bernie Sanders and she has the endorsement from the Blue Dog Democrats.
Oh,
Seems
wow.
like a nice big tent to me, so I think that's
Yeah.
a pretty interesting candidate.
And that seems hard to take issue with, but I guess, the idea is, certainly Bernie wouldn't be part of the establishment, but, I guess you got to take whatever you can get to make an argument against a candidate like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, she's got some real grassroots support. I don't wanna discount that by any stretch of the imagination, but, it's gonna, like, and I don't think primaries are a bad thing. I think this could help
Yeah.
Cooke sharpen her message and have to compete for those votes, if she does eventually win next week. And, I think we're seeing a couple different, there's a Republican primary in Tiffany's soon-to-be former district as well, where Sean Duffy's 26-year-old son-in-law is
I was going to
running in
ask
the
you about that to
Republican
close it out
primary
here.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Should we talk about that one next?
Yes. Yeah. Give us a lowdown. I did not realize that Sean Duffy had a family member running for Congress. So give us a lowdown. And let me start with it. Is this the same district that Duffy held, or is it a different one? It's possibly been redrawn since then too. But
Yeah, so it's with the district that Duffy held for a number of years in the 2010s, the 7th congressional district. After Duffy left, Tom Tiffany won the special election for that race. So again, this is the shift of power. It's a Northwoods, Wisconsin Republican Party now, and 26-year-old Michael Alfonso, who is the son-in-law of Sean Duffy. I don't know if he was going to be in the car for that road trip, goofy road trip that has been delayed, or how exactly that was going to work. But there has been a raft of campaign cash from lobbyists in the transportation industry that have flowed to Alfonso's campaign in that race. There are a lot of more kind of traditional Republicans who are running in that one. And then, Alfonso explained away his relative inexperience in that race by saying that he quote that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were also 26 when they were first elected to public office. So he's out there making some pretty lofty comparisons for himself in that district. I think the fact that Trump has endorsed him there, I mean, that's kind of the key thing for any Republican primary.
Yes.
That's tough to overcome, especially in a bigger field where there are a number of candidates. And so it's also been interesting to see that the Uline family that I mentioned before is those mega donors in Republican politics, especially in Wisconsin. Dick Uline has backed Alfonso, and Liz Uline has backed another candidate in the race. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic there. I certainly expect Alfonso will win that one, and that's a very Trumpy district. But it does, the Alfonso, Sean Duffy campaign cash from the transportation industry stuff. We'll see what happens with the Great American Road Trip if that ever sees the light of day.
Yes, it hasn't aired, and
we shall see. Yeah.
Is Duffy so much of a presence in Wisconsin these days? I mean, I feel like as part of the road trip hype, which for those who haven't followed this, there was all that money that sloshed in for Duffy to do his reality show, and now it's unclear if it's ever going to actually be published. So it's kind of a question of what were these big people who had stakes before Sean Duffy in terms of him being the transportation secretary? What were they really paying for there? But I know he and his family, I think they live in New Jersey because this was part of a Fox feature on them. So I guess I'm curious if he still has much of a toehold in Wisconsin or is kind of visible there.
Yeah, I think at this point, it just seems like he's more of a conservative media figure because I think his wife is in conservative media as well.
Yes, she's a Fox host.
And, but I do think when in the very early days of talking about the governor's primary last year, there was some talk about some folks wanting to see Sean Duffy get into the race. They thought he might be a good candidate, but I think Trump likes seeing him on TV and seeing him in the cabinet meetings and doing pull-ups with RFK Jr. and all of those different things. I think he would have been a factor in the primary for sure. Could have been the front runner with a Trump endorsement, but it seems like he's part of the Trump administration now more than he is a Wisconsin guy.
Yeah, I think once those guys get a taste of the national attention like that, Wisconsin probably seems like kind of small potatoes when you're used to being on Fox all the time and, kissing up to Trump at cabinet meetings and getting paid millions, to do a road trip show that you don't do. Actually doing some work might seem like kind of a burden. So, we'll leave it there, Dan. Thanks for your time today. Really appreciate it. I recommend everybody, the over 800 that we have live, and there'll be many more thousand who listen later, to check out the Recombobulation Area, which is Dan's great Wisconsin-focused newsletter. I'm sure you will have lots of coverage of the primary next week. And for those who want to learn more about the candidates in the Democratic gubernatorial primary, I know, Dan, you have interviewed pretty much all of them. I don't think, did you get an interview with Hong or not? I can't remember if I saw that on your site, but
Yep, I've
Most
interviewed the
okay,
4 candidates who are still in the race are all folks who I've interviewed. So,
nice. Did you
it's
ask
gonna
her?
be a wild few days.
Did you ask her about her to expound on her views on holidays at all, or is that just CNN who does
No,
that?
I didn't talk to her about that. That was it was the interview I had was well before, we talked more about the issues in Wisconsin. I think, at
Yeah.
the end of the day, people are gonna be voting on the issues. So,
Yeah, and I did, I noticed that in one of her subsequent comments, she mentioned that she's a curmudgeon. She's that exact curmudgeon about holidays, which
yeah,
I can kind of
yeah.
relate to. I generally like holidays, but I find they kind of leave me feeling empty inside sometimes, or it's just like too much family obligation. So I can kind of relate to her on that. So
Well,
my
and
heart
I can
goes out.
see
Yeah.
it as a chef too, right? And
Yes.
I worked in service industry jobs when I was younger, and retail and restaurants and whatever else. You don't want to be working that Black Friday shift. You don't want to be working that high profile holiday shift and missing time with your family or whatever
See,
it might be. So I get that too a little
this would have been a better answer than the one that she gave on CNN. And she said that, like, look, I'm used to working hard on the holidays, and for that reason, but it seems like she'll get through that pretty much unscathed, or at least minimally scathed in the primary, and she'll have a few more months to further explain her opposition to Thanksgiving and assorted other holidays, because I know that that's not the only one that she's opined on. But
bit.
we'll leave it there. So Dan, thanks again for your time. Hope people enjoyed the show, and I'll be back with Paul next week. It will not be on Friday, but it'll be probably on Wednesday. We're still sorting that out. But see you all next week. And Dan, thanks again. Keep up the good work.
Thanks so much for having me.